122 would legalize mushrooms containing psilocybin and psilocin and other hallucinogenic drugs used mainly for recreation. Ignore the smokescreen about psychedelics use in therapy. Prop 122 means more impaired motorists and minors. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, I think the Denver Gazette, really misses the point that this is about recreation. It's not. It's about therapy and it's about healing. Yes, there's, a decriminalization model and it decriminalizes, certain natural psychedelics. But as we just talked about, like some of them are already legal to grow as it is. But I think the big thing is like if you ask law enforcement, they're not telling you that psychedelics is causing more problems or impaired drivers. And in fact, you kind of see the opposite. Most people who are under the influence of psychedelics don't want to go inside a car. They don't even want to go inside a building. And you also see when you just look at the arrests in Colorado, it's like less than 1% of all arrests, all drug arrests, not just all drug arrests are like related to psilocybin. And so it's just not an issue from a public health and safety standpoint. But again, I think the Democrats, that's like drugs, fear, like let, let's put it out there.
Totally. Not to mention, it's like there are appropriate laws in place to disincentivize impaired driving, right? We don't need to categorize different drugs. It's like impaired driving, whether it's your phone, which is also basically a dopamine drug, or alcohol or otherwise. It's like there is infrastructure in place to address that. And so, again, I think it's about education and making sure people act responsibly. And not everybody's going to act responsibly, but I do feel like we've moved to a society where we've taken responsibility away from people. And so people act irresponsibly, in many cases, unfortunately.
Right, right. I completely agree. It's like driving under the influence of mushrooms was illegal before this passed, and it's illegal after it passes. And we have a whole system of pulling over impaired drivers, and it's something actually Colorado takes very, very seriously. We have very strict laws around it.
Of course, absolutely. Okay, the Denver Post editorial board said, however, we are not naive, and while the intent of legalizing possession and cultivation is for medical treatment, we fear a robust market for recreational use would thrive. Increased legal tolerance will increase demand, which will increase the temptation for profiteering. If there's one thing we know about drug use, it's that teens and young adults will be most tempted to use it, and they will be targeted by sellers. Psilocybin is not addictive, but is known to rarely cause psychosis and hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, where people re-experience hallucinations that they had while taking the drug and while not intoxicated. How do you respond to that one?
A couple points there. It's like psychedelics isn't for everyone. I think it's like, people a lot of times think, psychedelics is some panacea that's going to cure all their problems. And it's just not the case. It's like there's times and places, and for certain people who, need to break habits, it's really good. And for people who aren't very stable as they normally are, it might not be the best. And so yes, there is, it's not, there is some issues around it, but ultimately, though, like when we look at the measure that's actually put forward by the voters, it's like for what people actually voted on, they didn't vote on a robust market. They actually voted on supervised use, like the most regulated sort of like way to like unroll a drug possible. It's like you can only use it under the supervision of someone who's licensed by the state, and there's no sales. And so, the Denver Post is kind of like setting up this like, false, and it kind of like a straw man, and and trying to get people to vote at the time. It's like trying to get people to vote no on something that wasn't actually in front of them. So it was really a false argument. Now, look, will there be, will there, in the U.S. or in Canada, will there be a market around microdosing? I sure hope so. There's the last number I saw was like 600,000 people microdose like on a regular basis, and should they be taking products that aren't tested, that have no like safety profiles because they're underground? Like that doesn't make any sense. But that's not where we are today, and that's like, and who knows if we ever actually get there. But from a public policy standpoint, we should think about it. In this case, it's just talking about supervised use for for really any reason or no reason. It can be therapy, it can be a diagnosis, it can be spiritual. It's like, it's pretty broad, but it's also really, really controlled.
This is one that's trickier, and it's a topic that I'm still learning about, and stepping on people's toes sometimes when I share thoughts, and so I recognize that I have a lot to learn, but always trying to learn both from the indigenous community as well as people not in the indigenous community trying to find a holistic understanding. So this one came from the Native Coalition Against Prop 122, which said that Prop 122 stands to threaten, exploit, and commercialize indigenous peoples and spiritual traditions. It ignores critical issues pertaining to stewardship, conservation, intellectual property, and fair trade practices. This bill misleads and falsely informs the public. The bill is opposed due to the rampant neglect, abuse, and harm that has already occurred within psychedelic research. Further, it is opposed because the bill's co-authors have positioned themselves to profit from the legalizing and medicalizing of natural medicines to the exclusion of the greater community. It lacks inclusion of disproportionately impacted communities. The passing of Prop 122 positions these natural medicines for extractivism, some of which are not indigenous to Colorado, by those with limited understanding and knowledge of the medicines and their application. Sorry, this is a long one, which will ultimately create further inequities, criminalizing and desecration of the sacred. There's a lot in there, so you don't have to talk to every point, but obviously there is concern about indigenous perspectives and attaining their traditions without being exploited in kind of a capitalistic model. So I know you touched on it a little bit, but would love to unpack that further.
Yeah, I mean, I think first, this like coalition is, it's kind of like, I don't know who it is. They didn't put a name on it. There's no contact information. People have tried to get a hold of them. No one knows who it is. So we don't know like what indigenous voices are you actually speaking for? I think it's like a big question. And then there's a lot of and to say that like the indigenous community speaking one monolithic voice is just not true. There's people who come from all different like spectrums, and one of the one more larger groups working on indigenous plant medicines, Sharkuna did endorse our measure. So it's not like
Right.
it's hey, there's people against it, there's people for it. Well, actually, that is what it's like. It's not like everyone's against it. I think a couple things. When you have to look at each substance differently. And so I think when you look at psilocybin and you say, hey, what cultures did use psilocybin mushrooms, it's pretty broad. And Paul Sandwich recently talked about this, and he had like a map of just cultures all around the world, from Ireland to Japan, who have like indigenous uses of psilocybin. So that's like one substance, and like, hey, what does it mean to get back to these cultures, and how do we honor these, and how do we uncover past destroyed lineages that have really been kind of destroyed by Catholicism and different forms of destructive colonialism. But then when you start to look at other pieces of this puzzle, like ayahuasca or ibogaine, and each one needs to be analyzed separately, and like, what does that tradition actually, what are they okay with, and what are they not okay with, and that's why it's like in our measure, we're not regulating ayahuasca. We literally just decriminalizing it. We're providing more protections for those who are using it. And maybe one day if it makes sense, it'll be regulated. Maybe it never will. So I think it's like each substance has to be looked at differently. But with that said, it's like I'm not indigenous, and it's not. I do think and I hope during this implementation process, we can center some of these conversations around the indigenous leaders and the indigenous voice. I'd love to figure out it's like, how do we sort of like build in the principles that surround the Nagoya Protocol into what we're doing in Colorado. Even though the U.S. isn't a signatory on the Nagoya Protocol, that doesn't mean we can't build into our regulated system some sort of like benefit honoring or benefit sharing to either local tribes in Colorado or to these intergenerational wisdom traditions in other countries that have been stewarding and protecting this medicine. And that is actually what I think is like appropriate. It's like, yes, if you're going to make money off of a tribal wisdom, like you should give back to that, and there should be the free and prior informed consent before you even do it. So there's a lot of issues to unpack here, and I think we'll just see how this all unfolds, through the implementation process. And there's and we get criticized for this too, because it's like on the advisory board there's no reserved seats. It's like, hey, you need to experience these various different areas, except there is, it's like the only reserved seat is for someone with with a experience with the indigenous use of these medicines. And so it's like we're trying our best. And when you look at like our equity-based program that's even built into this, there's supposed to be preferences for those who have indigenously used these medicines, both in obtaining facilitator training licenses or healing center licenses or access to these medicines on the regulated side. But all of that said, I think the short story of it all is like why we put together this decriminalized community use model is actually to provide more protections, than less in this community. We're actually just removing criminal protections. We're instituting civil protections around child rearing and professional licensure if you're engaging in the personal use of these medicines. Yeah, I think it's like we're trying our best, and I hope we can, really center some of these next conversations around, different indigenous voices.